I'm Viv Bozalek, and I'm co-hosting this series and this webinar with Candace Kuby. The webinar series is made possible by a collaborative partnership between our two universities. That's the University of Missouri system and the University of the Western Cape in Cape Town, South Africa. And the partnership started ages ago in 1986 between our two universities. And funding comes from the University of Missouri South African Education Program Committee, which supports academic exchanges between our two universities and provides opportunities for teaching and learning, research, community engagement also between the two universities. So we're very grateful to our university's long-time collaboration and the support for this particular webinar series. Today, our panelists are Alecia Jackson, who's a professor of educational research at Appalachian. Is that how you pronounce it?
Appalachian.
Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, where she's also affiliated faculty in Gender, Women's and Sexuality Studies program, and Lisa Mazzei, who's Professor of Education Studies at the University of Oregon, USA, where she also holds a courtesy appointment in the Department of Philosophy. Welcome, Lisa and Alecia. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Candace is going to just introduce Erin now.
Yes, so I'd like to also introduce Erin Price. She's an instructor and PhD student here at the University of Missouri in the College of Education, and I have the pleasure of working with her as a graduate research assistant. Erin is an artist and an art educator with experience coordinating preschool through secondary art education in U.S. public schools, as well as community-based art explorations at home and abroad. Erin is particularly interested in intersections of art and inquiry, including the role of material invitations, affect, and artistic encounters, and the becomings of identity and community. Erin is providing technical support for the webinar platform today, and she'll assist us in moderating the question and answer portion of the webinar. In addition, as we've noted each time, we are so grateful for her artistic abilities and her gracious willingness to provide all of the beautiful artwork for this webinar series. So you'll see her artwork on the webpage and the promotional materials and when the videos are uploaded to YouTube. So thank you, Erin, for all of your technical support and artistic support in making the webinar series possible.
Thank you, Candace. It is my pleasure to introduce our two amazing co-hosts without whom this webinar series would not be possible. Vivienne Bozalek is an emerita professor in women's and gender studies at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa. She's also an honorary professor in the Center for Higher Education Research, Teaching and Learning at Rhodes University. She holds a PhD from Utrecht University, and her research interests and publications include political ethics of care and social justice, post-humanism and feminist new materialisms, and innovative pedagogical practices in higher education. Her most recent co-edited books include Post-Humanism and Political Care Ethics for Reconfiguring Higher Education. Dr. Candace Kuby is an associate professor of learning, teaching, and curriculum at the University of Missouri, also department chair and director of Qualitative Inquiry. Her research interests include the coming to be of literacies when young children work with artistic and digital tools, and also approaches and pedagogies of qualitative inquiry when thinking with post-structural and post-humanist philosophies. She is the co-author of several books, including Speculative Pedagogies of Qualitative Inquiry, Post-Humanism and Literacy Education, Knowing, Becoming, Doing Literacies. And her work has also appeared in numerous journals, including the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, Journal of Early Childhood Literacy, and the Journal of Literacy Research. I'm just so thankful to be a part of these sessions, to work with not only the panelists with whom we're learning, but also Dr. Kuby and Dr. Bozalek. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Erin. I'm just going to say a little bit about the Zoom webinar platform. So it's instead of a meeting platform, we have a webinar platform. To allow a large number of people, we actually have 102 participants thus far attending this webinar, which we're delighted about. So as you'll see, only the hosts and panelists have the video and audio functions. And we are recording this webinar for public viewing later on YouTube. So the chat function is open for you to connect with other attendees during the webinar. But we do request that if you have questions for the panelists, you use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen. So this is going to make it easier for us to moderate the questions. So we're not scrolling through the chat and the question Q&A function. So please do take a moment to locate that button on your screen. So, and this is how it's going to work, the structure of the webinar. For the first 30 to 40 minutes, Candace is going to ask Lisa and Alecia 4 main questions that we've done before, which is our common thread for all the webinars in the series. You can also find those questions on our webpage. And when discussing these questions, our panelists might share examples from their scholarship and the suggested readings, which I hope you've had a chance to look at, which have been posted on the website. Then Candace is going to spend some time talking to Lisa and Alecia on how they mentor and teach graduate students while they engage in post-philosophies in the doing of inquiry. And we want this webinar series to open up spaces for conversations that aren't discussed publicly on how to navigate the academy and the doing of inquiry, which seems to be more difficult in some regions of the world than others. And then the last thing we're going to do is we'll open up a space for questions from everyone attending the webinar, and this will last for 30 minutes. But as we go along, if you think of questions while Alecia and Lisa are talking, please do put them in the Q&A portion, and we will be watching them throughout. So we might have to group similar questions, as Candace said, in order to get through them all. And I'm going to hand over now to Candace.
Thanks so much, Viv. So I'm going to share a little bit more about our 2 panelists, and then we're going to jump into our 4 questions. So Alecia Jackson, as Viv said, is a professor of educational research at Appalachian State University. And she teaches theory and research at the master's and doctoral levels. Her research interests bring feminist, post-structural, and post-human theories of power knowledge, language, materiality, and subjectivity to bear on a range of overlapping topics, such as deconstructions of voice and method, conceptual analyses of resistance, freedom, and agency, and qualitative analysis in the posts. Alecia's work seeks to animate philosophical frameworks in the production of the new, and her current projects are focused on the ontological turn, qualitative inquiry, and thought. She has publications in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, Qualitative Inquiry, the International Review of Qualitative Research, and Gender in Education. We're so glad that you could join us, Alecia. And Lisa Mazzei is a professor of education studies at the University of Oregon. She's a feminist qualitative methodologist and is interested in philosophically informed inquiry that produces research practices that emerge as a process methodology. She is a methodological innovator, and her work is widely read and cited across many disciplines. She has publications in Educational Researcher, British Education Research Journal, Gender in Education, International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, and Qualitative Inquiry. She is also the author of the book Inhabited Silence in Qualitative Research. And then jointly together, as many of us know, they publish articles as well as books together, and they have co-authored the book Thinking with Theory in Qualitative Research and co-edited the book Voice in Qualitative Inquiry. So welcome, Lisa. So I must say, I am delighted to have this conversation with you both today. I remember being at a conference many years ago and talking about how theory is an analytical tool for me. Or my dissertation advisor used to ask me, Candace, what is that theory asking of your data? And somebody asked me at that conference if I had read your 2012 book, Thinking with Theory, and I said no. And they said, you're gonna love it. So I quickly ordered it. And I remember over the summer sitting in a coffee shop and highlighting and marking up all the pages. It continues to be a huge influence on my own thinking and teaching. So thank you for writing that book together. And on a personal note, you have both been great mentors to me and so generous with your time and advice. I'm sure many other people have similar sentiments that are joining us today. So thanks to you both.
Thank you. We had good models.
Well, perhaps you can talk about that a little bit. And before we officially started the webinar, you had mentioned that a student had asked you, Lisa, to tell kind of your origin story of how you came to be together as thinkers, collaborators, scholars. And I've heard you share that story once. So maybe just a way to introduce you to kind of as collective thinkers together, share a little bit about how you came to be Alecia and Lisa together, and then we'll jump in with our 4 questions.
All right. I'll start and then interrupt me, Alecia, and add. So this was 2006. I was AERA in I think it was San Francisco. I was getting ready to embark on an adventure to going to Manchester Metropolitan University to work with fabulous folks there, Maggie McClure, Harry Torrance, and others. And I was presenting a paper on some of my voice work. But in the meantime, I had been working on a paper about how mentoring practices for student teachers actually function to normalize. And so it was kind of, I had looked for people who were doing some of this work, and I'd found this article by a woman, professor named Alecia Jackson, and I think the title was Multiple Annies. Is that the right title for that? Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And so I presented my session at AERA, and after the session, Alecia comes up to introduce herself and said she just, she wanted to say hello, that she had read some of my work. And when she said her name, I said, oh my gosh, I just read your article, Multiple Annies. So we went out into the hallway, talked for an hour or more. I think you were catching a flight that day and had to leave. So we talked about, okay, here's the funny part of the story. I told this to my students last night. We talked about an idea for a panel session the next year at AERA. And we wanted to put together a panel on voice and troubling voice and so forth. So that was where we left it. I left for England, a few months later. And in the fall, I was attending the British Education Research Association conference, was milling around the book exhibit and started chatting with one of the editors from Routledge, Philip Mudd. And he started asking me, what I was doing and where I was and what project, good editor always says, what project are you working on? And I told him about this idea that Alecia and I had for this. Well, I didn't say it was for a panel. I just said that, told him about this assembling a group of scholars to talk about voice and this and that. And he said, well, that sounds like a fabulous idea. Can you get a proposal to me in a month? So I'm at the conference emailing this woman I've met one time saying, guess what? Somebody wants us to write a book proposal. So do you want to finish the rest of the story, Alecia, how it was poo-pooed by the reviewers? Not poo-pooed, but.
No, you keep going. I'm enjoying listening to it.
So we put together this proposal and they sent it out for review. It got very good reviews, but the one concern from the reviewers was, well, it's a great idea, but they'll never be able to pull it off because of some of the scholars we had named that we were going to have contributing. Well, what they didn't know is that I had studied with Patty Lather at Ohio State University. I had been overlapping colleagues with Elizabeth St. Pierre at Ohio State. Alecia had studied with Betty at the University of Georgia, and we had these connections with some fabulous feminist scholars based on our mentoring and work from our doctoral studies. So the rest is history.
Well, thanks for starting us with that story. And I think it's beautiful to hear how conference spaces are places that might produce these collaborative thinking partnerships, and how many of us are missing that in our times today when we're not able to come together in person. So use the chat function. Maybe there's some people who might connect today, and who knows, in 2 or 3 years, we might see some collaborative pieces coming out because of the space that we're trying to cultivate with the webinar series. Well, let's get into our questions. So the first question we're asking all of our panelists in the series is, how does your philosophical approach influence your ways of doing inquiry? I'm gonna start us off, Alecia, maybe, and then Lisa.
Sure, I'll go. Yeah,
I didn't want to be all the talking.
Yes. First, thanks everyone for being here, and thank you, Candace and Viv, for inviting us. I've been looking forward to this for a while. I hope that my internet connection is fine. We're doing online remote school as we speak, so there's a lot of people using the internet in my home right now, including my partner who's also teaching at the university right now. So I'm hoping we'll hold steady. If I, somehow sound a little womply, just let me know and I'll repeat. So I've thought a lot about this question, and I had to think a lot about how it all started for me. And because I think that this genealogy is really important, that Lisa began to talk about in terms of who our mentors have been and how impactful and just crucial that mentoring has been to me and Lisa, I think, and us collectively. She's mentioned our academic genealogy already. And so I'll just sort of back up a little bit and say a couple of things about that. So I grew up in rural North Georgia in the US South, and was a high school English teacher for most of my teaching years, for I think 7 years or so, and then did a master's degree in literacy, and then decided to go on and pursue my PhD in language education, and wanted to go back to the University of Georgia where I did my undergrad. And so I showed up and met my advisor, Betty St. Pierre, and we just had a very short conversation the very first time in her office. And she just asked me, what am I interested in? And I started talking. And I said something, I was taking also some women's studies courses at the time. And I mentioned that I was really interested in power. And if anyone knows Betty, she's very organized. And she opened her drawer of her desk and she pulled out a sticky note. And I still have it on my desk in my office. And she wrote down Foucault, Discipline and Punish. And she handed me the sticky note. She said, read this. And so I took it and started reading, and it just shifted everything for me. And I know that many of you listening have had those moments with the text, have had those moments with philosophy, or, maybe not even philosophy, but any text that just uses language that you've never been able to speak on your own. And that was the moment for me. That was one of those, top 5 moments that changed my life, was Betty's handing me that sticky note, lime green and blue pen. I still have it. And so I tell that story because I think that we all need to understand, I think, this idea of a theory really choosing us. And that's something that I say a lot to students. And I know that Betty has probably said that to me many times. But it was that moment of finding something finding me and luring and pulling me into it. So that was kind of a pivotal moment that my philosophical approach became so obvious. Now, not that it was easy. I didn't, I read the book and it did a lot to me, that ontological way, but I didn't really understand what was going on in the book. So, we had to do a lot of rereading and talking about it and so forth. But that was, a little bit of how everything really came together for me. And I was very fortunate to have Betty to guide me through all of this, and also let me do any independent study I wanted to do for my degree. I think I did more independent studies than than I did actually taking classes. So that was also another fortunate thing, is that this happened early in terms of developing my philosophical approach. It happened very early on in my program. I would say that was week 2 when I met with Betty and she introduced me to that. And then her generosity in saying, take 3 credit hours and read of grammatology, and then let's talk about it. So I had a very different experience in terms of developing this approach, with a lot of independence and a lot of guidance, you know, in the material itself. So with that said, I would just, you know, say that I was from the very beginning drawn to language theory as someone who, you know, was an English teacher, and my, you know, my master's degree, like I said, is in literacy studies. I was always drawn to theories of language. And so post-structuralism will always be my, you know, my first love. And I'll always be drawn to it. You know, that Derrida, Spivak, and deconstruction was what I really cut my teeth on, so to speak. Because it is a linguistic theory, post-structuralism really fit with what I, you know, the way that I always wanted to think about the world in terms of language. And when I began to read Foucault, his theory of discourse just made sense to me automatically. It's just, I saw it everywhere. As soon as I began to read about deconstruction and discourse and power knowledge, the doublet power knowledge, I could not see it everywhere I went. So I would say that you know, my philosophical approach is always going to be informed by post-structural theories of language and discourse and power and knowledge, and then I would widen that, or I would think about that too in terms of philosophy of difference. I would say that I've been thinking about what is my philosophical approach within those. And so I think there's 2. I think the philosophy of difference is one that I always come back to, using Deleuze and Derrida and their theories of difference, difference and multiplicities, and for Deleuze, it's becomings. Again, that's just, it just really gives me some language for how I see things, and how I see the world becoming. And then I would also say another philosophical approach would be a philosophy of creation. And that's also from Deleuze and also Foucault. I think that in a philosophy of creation, it has led me to do my most recent work on thought and thinking. And that has been, in the last 3 or 4 years, that is really where I've been centering my reading on what it means to think, and what is thought, and how does it emerge, and what are we doing when we're thinking. And I can talk more about that later, but I would say that those are 2 philosophical approaches: the philosophy of difference and a philosophy of creation. And then, of course, finally, the feminist philosophers who have multiplied the work of Foucault and Deleuze and Derrida. And so I'm still, I read Butler every time she writes anything, even if it's in, more popular media, I read it. Karen Barad, of course, her book I'm still reading. I don't know if I'll ever finish it. And by that, I mean, I'm rereading it over and over. And of course, I think the most important feminist philosopher is Elizabeth Grosz, and her multiplication, I'll say, of the way that she's taking up Deleuze's geophilosophy for me. When I was working on my paper on the refrain, I relied heavily on the ways in which that she wrote about the refrain, and the whole entire philosophy of deterritorialization has been really important to my work. So that's me in a nutshell. So I'll pass it over to Lisa and let her talk through hers.
Thanks. It's interesting listening to you, Alecia, and thinking about my own responses, how difficult it is for me to separate thinking about my own thinking and development, and then the question that we'll get to later on about teaching and mentoring. But I want to echo what Alecia said in terms of my own beginnings. Probably first term of my PhD program, having the people who've been at Ohio State, when you say 800, that was the introductory course that Patty Lather taught. And it was the first in the methodological series, but it was very much a course about philosophy, of which I knew nothing really. And it was, it just sort of, it blew apart all of the foundations of how I thought about the world. And so when I think about, labels, like Alecia, I really don't know how to locate myself, except when we teach the courses at Oregon, we talk about post-foundational ways of thinking. And so that's very broad, I know. But the other thing that happened for me at Ohio State was, again, an emergent experience. And I want to talk about that more with my own students later, but had a course that was taught by two professors. It was taught by Mary Leach and Patty Lather. And I think there were 7 or 9 of us in the course. Betty was in the course. And the only thing we did that term was we read Gayatri Spivak's Translator's Preface of Grammatology. And I was not grounded in theories of language and didn't know that was where I was going to land. But it really opened up an entirely different set of questions. And so when I think about your question, how do philosophical approaches influence your ways of doing inquiry? It's really everything. It's the questions that are askable. It's the considerations of what counts as data, if we still want to talk about data, what counts as research. And because of that early introduction to Derrida's work, that really is the thread that propelled me to interrogate what counts as voice, what counts as what we can consider in terms of doing research. I have also moved, while Derrida is my first love, and I always return to Derrida. If you can read the books back there, I have the big biography on the shelf, but I am very much engaging theories of process, reading a lot of Whitehead, still trying to understand Whitehead and make some sense of how he informs this way of thinking differently about particularly the subject and about experience. And Deleuze is so much, these theorists that sort of travel in the same thinking circles, I'll just say. And I liked Alicia's comment about how a theorist, I don't know if this is exactly what you said, but how a theorist chooses you. And that really, we'll talk about this more in terms of our work together, but that's really at the heart of the work we've done together, is the way in which these things emerge in the middle of this thinking process. And so I guess the final thing for me is thinking about how sense gets made. And that's whatever philosophical approach I'm thinking about, or that is really forming me, it's all of those things. I could go on, but I'll save more for the Q&A period.
Okay. So I want to connect us to some of the suggested readings that you all suggested and we have posted on our website in connecting to this question. So you have a co-author piece in the, I think, 2018 Sage Handbook of Qual Research, and you talk about the necessity of theory. You write about how theory is responsive rather than an application or a reflection. And you also, I love the quote you pulled from Spivak in that chapter about theory and concepts as mental furniture. And so when I think about that chapter that you've written collectively, and then the two pieces that you also suggested, so Lisa's piece about making a minor inquiry and Alicia's piece about thinking without methods. I mean, Lisa, you talk about how might, concepts produce new practices and kind of this notion of a minor inquiry. And Alecia, you talk about, to create, which you mentioned earlier, you're really interested in this notion of creation is to generate new relations of thought. So maybe talk to us a little bit about some of the theorists that you both shared, which have some overlaps, and some of you draw on different theorists. What is this notion of necessity of theory and this idea of it being responsive? I think you've mentioned how it chooses you. And then kind of the more dogmatic kind of way that we talk about theory is applying it kind of in the academy more broadly. So maybe a little bit of time on that before we go on to our second question.
I mean, we talk about this in that chapter and in the book, about the fact that if we just rely on our experience, then we reproduce what we already know, and we reproduce sameness. And so for me anyway, the necessity of theory is about unsettling this, not unsettling, it's shaking us loose from this complacency, from this familiarity, from this sameness. And it's a provocateur, if you will. It's a way, it's a thinking with that is an enactment that produces an entirely, not just a different way of thinking, it's a different being and a different approach. Go ahead, Alecia.
Yeah, no, that I don't have a whole lot to add to that, except I'll not accept, but I will add that in that chapter that you've mentioned, the handbook chapter, I want to mention that Spivak quote about the mental furniture. And I remember reading her little book readings and coming upon that quote. And I think I texted Lisa and I said, I've just found something that just really articulates how we are using the necessity of theory, in that when you read a theory and you read it really well, and this is Spivak, not me, she says you enter that person's conceptual grammar, and that language washes over you and it gets in your bones, it gets inside you, and then it becomes a reflex. And I mentioned this earlier, and Lisa talks about it, and all of you who have encountered theories that you can't think without anymore, you know what it feels like to have that reflex. And that's what Spivak is talking about in that particular moment of that text. She says, if you watch professional athletes perform, they've done the movements over and over, and it's not that they're just kind of in a rut with it, but it's just this reflex. It's this automatic, beautiful reflex where they already know kind of what to do and how to respond. So using both Foucault's and Spivak's work on how they talk about theory, which is they're trying to break out of the binary of theory and practice. So I think that's one of the important things to understand about the necessity of theory, is a lot of times, and especially I've noticed this when students first come into my classes, they think that theory is just, out there away from what they do. And theory is actually, for Foucault and Spivak and all these other philosophers that we've named, theory is a doing. It's not, theory is a practice. It's an activity. Barad says it's material. So I think that one of the ways that we try to talk about the necessity of theory is that it's not an application. You just don't stick it into something. It's always already there. It's not coming from somewhere else. It's always already in the middle of whatever it is you're doing and wanting to think about. So I think just that language shift away from theory as application to theory as practice, to theory as responsive, all of that, that's a shift that these philosophical approaches allow us to begin to talk about and do, and to keep theory and practice no longer in that, in that binary opposition. So that's what I would add. Yeah.
We were talking last night in class about theory as enacting theoretical concepts. And so not even just thinking with or writing with. And I wrote an article with two, they're former students now, but we talked about enactments of a minor inquiry or enactments of deconstruction. When Alecia and I write about deconstruction as the event, that it's enactments. It's not just theoretical suppositions.
So let's think about the second question we're asking panelists, which connects, of course, to this one. What does your philosophical approach make thinkable or possible for inquiry? And so often, students will ask me questions about, well, how does it relate to things like literature reviews, data analysis, and so forth? So, you might pick one or two because you've each mentioned a couple of philosophical concepts and ways that you approach inquiry, but help us understand as you are enacting those and thinking with, and it becomes, like Alecia said, this reflex, what does it make thinkable or possible in the doing of inquiry for you both?
I think it's I mean, when I first saw the question, it's everything. Because, and in working with students, talking about starting with what are the epistemological and ontological assumptions, and being grounded in that in a way that if this is what you're taking up, if this is what you're enacting, then there are only certain ways you can think about what is, to use this language, what is your unit of analysis? Are you focused on the individual experience of the individual, or in all of the theories that we're talking about? No, we're not. I'm not. And so thinking about the idea of a collective, and how Deleuze helps me think about the idea of a collective, how Whitehead helps me think about the idea of collective. I'll use a more specific example in terms of really started my thinking this way was in my dissertation research. I did research with white teachers, and I was interested in how they thought about their own racial identity and the way in which this impacted curricular and pedagogical decisions. So, I was a good researcher. Had a year-long study, lots of observational data, lots of interview data, focus groups, and so forth. And then I had been steeped in thinking with these theories, and I got to the point of really trying to write my analysis, although I was doing analysis all the time. And I felt like I didn't have the right data. The teachers weren't talking about their racial identities. They were, when I went back and looked at the transcripts, they were either answering different questions or deflecting questions, or talking about themselves, only recognizing themselves in the conversation as opposed to the other. And I had been reading a lot of poetry at the time as a way of trying to get myself kind of unstuck from just rigid ways of thinking and writing. And of course, steeped in Derrida. And it was just one of Alecia talked about kind of that moment with Foucault. I was at the Dodge Poetry Festival, and was at, which is held in New Jersey. Well, it used to be every couple of years. And there was a session with Robert Haas, who was then the poet laureate, Bridget Pegeen Kelly, and Gerald Stern, someone else. And the topic of the session was the place of silence in poetry. And they started talking about the way in which silence is not absence, silence and the breath is part of the poem. And I started thinking that and my data and deconstruction together. And it was, not that I don't have data, I'm going about it all wrong. And so that's an example of when I say it's everything, I couldn't think that way. I couldn't theorize that way without really taking on those assumptions about epistemology and ontology and the way in which Derrida theorized that language works.
So before Alecia jumps in, I just want to say that example, I love hearing you talk about it, Lisa, because often with students, we talk about, it's not just reading philosophers or theorists, but it's our everyday, sometimes mundane interactions in the world. And so being at this event and hearing somebody talk about poetry and silence, and then what that provoked for you, or maybe, Matsumi says, shock our thought, or, it seems like it took you on this path that was quite unexpected, but it invited you to engage in a different way with your inquiry. So I appreciate sharing that. And it's kind of a backstory to your book, Inhibited Silence. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, sure.
So for you, Alecia, what does your philosophical approach make thinkable or possible?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this question too. And I agree with Lisa that it's everything. And I can't talk about this without also talking about some of my teaching too, because it's imbricated. But one thing that it's helped me to make thinkable or possible is actually refusals. Saying no to method, really interrogating about, well, where do I start? I've completely, shifted the way that I even think about qualitative inquiry. I can't even really teach it anymore, and I don't. And it confuses students, who read a lot of traditional, books, and then they get to me, and then, we don't even start with method at all. We start with concepts. So for me, what it's opened up is just being on the outside of conventional qualitative inquiry. And, that has led me to really try to understand, or try to think about, well, what does it mean to think? What are we doing when we're thinking? How do we think differently? How do we get there? How do we think the outside of strata and where we are? So for me, it's just a complete refusal and undoing of these systems and structures that, we've all inherited, and that are all probably part of curriculum in higher ed and teaching research. So for me, it's just giving me a complete excuse to start somewhere else, start with a concept. Don't teach method. I have students read, we hardly, even though I teach ed research, we hardly read it. We read humanities research. We read things way outside our own disciplines. So I think it's just really what it's made possible is just all these different connections, how we are able to, I've mentioned a philosophy of creation. I think that really reorients the way that I think about inquiry too, that what can we make, what can we create through the way in which we use concepts. So the other thing I'll say is a lot of, like what Lisa said, in terms of it being everywhere, is that reading philosophy and reading about theoretical, or reading with theoretical concepts, I can't do that without the world. It's not an isolating activity. For example, I was teaching a doctoral elective on posthumanism and new materialism. It's just an intro course, and looking at some of the work and in that area. And I happened to sit down on a couple of weeks ago on a school night, and with my teenagers, and we watched My Octopus Teacher. And I couldn't watch that movie without thinking, or that documentary without thinking about everything that we've been reading in that class. And one of the key texts we were using is the Posthuman Glossary, and we're just sort of picking up concepts and reading about those concepts. And so what we did in that next class was we watched My Octopus Teacher, and we watched that movie with the concepts. We were talking a lot about it, and especially, Barad's accountability and relationality and interaction. And I mean, it's all over all over that documentary. And the actors in that film, they never use that language of posthumanism, but it's everywhere. And the materialism and the entanglements and the localities, and anyway, it's all there. So I think that, and then we talked in class too about how would you use a documentary such as this as inquiry? How can we open up what counts as all of these things that Lisa's already mentioned, data and, quote, analysis and method and all of that. So I think that, to sum up, I think that what it makes possible are these different, not just different ways of doing inquiry, but just reaching into the outside and into other disciplines and other forms to really enable us to do something completely different and unrecognizable.
I love those examples. When I teach a philosophy class, we often will bring in podcast series or documentaries or just an event in the news that's happening, and really think about how the philosophical concepts that we're talking about, like, they're lived out and they're in our everyday world. And
yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's a great example. It made me think about the last time I taught a course in ethnography. We listened to Serial, the podcast, both of them, and it raised up so many philosophical questions about truth and knowledge and power and all of that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that all of theory is in the world, and I think that is something that has been really important to me, and in how not only how I do inquiry, but also how I teach.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we can end this question with a quote from the end of your article, Alecia. I'll read it because I come back to this paragraph a lot, and I think it fits with what we're talking about. So at the end of the article, the suggested reading about thinking without method, you write at the very end, in other words, critiquing method is not enough. Experimenting with method differently is not enough. We do not need method to think. Our task then is to keep creating the new, our task then is to keep creating the new without method, doing without method by staying on its outside in the act of creative destruction. So I always come back to that paragraph. It provokes a lot of thought for me. I don't know if there's anything you want to comment on about how you chose to end that article or those statements there.
Yeah, I don't know that do we ever choose to end something? I don't know. I remember writing those sentences. I remember exactly where I was sitting and exactly what I was feeling. I was feeling like really, really pumped up by what I had just written. And it just literally just came out, that we don't need any of it. We don't need it. So that's just, and I think probably, that article was for a special issue, and Betty read that article, and she really pushes me and asks me really hard questions. And she writes with, in between the lines, she'll ask me questions. And so I'm sure that some of that also was a result of Betty just saying, all right, well, just say what you want to say, don't beat around the bush, just say it. And so I wanted to be really, bold about that, and that this isn't, and I think Lisa and I have had lots of conversations about this. We don't want our work to be just, kind of additive, just something, necessarily that is added to what is already being done in qualitative inquiry. We want it to be on the outside of that altogether, and become, Deleuze says difference is everywhere. And so I think that we want our work to be a part of that difference.
Mm-hmm. So this leads to our third question. And I'm really curious to see how you two will answer this question. So what are your perspectives on methodology and or methods, and how do you envision that in your approaches to doing inquiry? So Lisa, what are your thoughts on that question?
Well, I think in some ways, maybe we've answered this already, that I don't teach. I'm like Alecia. Now, maybe I'm not as strident as she is. I don't teach method. I don't teach students how to do interviewing. I don't teach them how to do analysis. I teach them, part of this is the way that the courses are organized in our doctoral program, but they're framed around philosophical traditions, and the way in which those traditions then make, again, it comes back to this, what is askable and knowable, what counts as knowledge. And so that's what we do. Now, we've been having some interesting conversations in our department about what does it mean to prepare students to be able to do this work. And, if a student comes to me and wants to know about interviewing, I've got some really excellent books I can give them. Alecia and I have had this conversation before. Here, read this book. It'll tell you what you need to know. It'll give you some information about, structuring interviews and just practice and do it. In this class right now, the students are doing an analysis project. They're having to choose a concept. This will sound familiar. They have to choose a concept and develop an analytic question and work with some data. And it could be, a documentary, it could be a school board meeting, it could be anything. And I admit to them, yes, we're going about this a little bit backward because you're not immersed in this right now. But the point is, I want them to try it. I want them to try it on. I want them to try to enact something and see what emerges. And so so when I'm teaching them to do analysis, it's not, this is how you do it. It's take a concept, take something you're interested in and try it on. Not try it on, work it, and see what it produces. And then the other part of that is this concept, this goes back to, I remember Maggie McClure when I first started reading Deleuze, and she kept pressing me to, it's like, what is this concept, or what is this theorist allowing you to do that you couldn't do with Derrida? So part of it within the students is, what is this? is this doing the work that you need it to do, that you want it to do? And if it's not, then find another concept. Find something else that will open up difference, to use Alecia's language. So that's how I think about method. And it's not, for me, in terms of it's not, students can, you know, they're smart, they can get the tools on their own. It's the thinking part. It's the questioning. It's the considering the different ways to approach even what we mean when we say inquiry. So that's how, and like I say, then with the course sequence that we have, we look at how does this look differently in these different philosophical traditions.
Alecia, what about you? What are your thoughts on methodology and methods? I know you've talked a little bit about it, but is there more you'd like to add?
Yeah, just a little bit more maybe. I think, you know, what has really shaped my thinking on it is, I was reading, and I'm not going to be able to remember the title of the book, but it was an interview with Deleuze, and he's being questioned about that famous phrase, "Thought does not need a method." And so he starts talking about a spider. And this influenced the way I was thinking about thinking without method, because this spider strategy that he described completely shifted for me, because, and it's a way that I can also talk about that there is usually a method to inquiry. But it's not what we think it is. It's not ready-made. It's not the thing that has come before us. It's not where it's not the thing that everybody knows how to do. He talks about a spider, when it spins its web, it doesn't have an intention or a purpose. It's just sort of, you know, doing its thing, and the strategy for spinning the web emerges, and it's different every time. You know, the spider will go somewhere else and spin a different web, and it looks different. It's attached to different things. So anyway, the thing that is important there, and that description of this insect, is that the strategy is revealed along the way. And the strategy reveals itself also kind of when you're at a stopping point and you look back and you say, well, this worked and this didn't. And that emerges as your method. So it really has shaped the way that I think about where, you know, what method, not only what method is, but where it is. So if it's revealed along the way and then you look back and you're like, oh, okay, well, that worked, that didn't work, then you begin to assemble that. And so that's what, you know, that spider strategy is something that I actually use in teaching, you know, and we can talk about this. Well, this is a later question, but I'll mention it and we can return to it. But even now that students, when some of my students are doing their research proposals, you know, for their dissertations, I'm like, listen, you know, just write a few things down for method, and what you are thinking might be some things that you might do, but we don't need your path and your plan and your validity and all that. Just don't even do it. And so it's a little shocking, you know, to other committee members, but then I've been on master's theses committees in the English department at our university, and their proposals are only, you know, 20 pages long, and there's no method. It's just, I'm going to read these texts and I'm asking this question. And so, you know, I've really stripped down in terms of this question about perspective on method. I've really stripped down the way in which I've talked about method. I don't teach it. I talk about what's your question and what are you going to engage in to, you know, really think through this question. And we talk a lot about, you know, how does this open up to something that you could not have predetermined and predicted. You know, I could not have predicted that my octopus teacher would have been a key teaching moment. But I made room for that, you know, because I wasn't following a method. And so that's what I try to think about in terms of these approaches, philosophical approaches toward method and methodology, is that if you're not on a predetermined, ready-made, common sense normative path, then you're opened up to everything. And that could make all the difference in your inquiry.
So before we get to our last question, I think I want to pull together some things I'm hearing, but also questions I often get asked to students if they read your book or, you know, your pieces around thinking with theory. And so what I think I'm hearing is even how you were just talking, Alecia, about method and the example of the spider and how Deleuze used that example. And when I hear people talk about thinking with theory, students will say, can I think with any theory? Are there certain theories that lend themselves better to think with than others? And I'm starting to wonder, perhaps the focus so much on that word theory that we need to back up to the word thinking, and how the two of you are thinking about what thinking is, and kind of the concepts and the thinkers that are influencing how you come to understand the notion of thought and thinking. So maybe before we get to our last question here, your handbook chapter that you had as a suggested reading, I believe, opens up a space to think about the ontological and epistemological assumptions about thinking with theory. Any thoughts then about, are there theories that are better to think with? Is this really more about just changing our ways of thinking about what thought is? Because you've also mentioned that we think with the world, we think with the documentary that we see. So any thoughts on that before we scoot to our last question?
Well, I think we're pretty direct in that handbook chapter, that from our approach, not any theory will do, that if it's not post-foundational, then we're still talking about interpretive practices. And so, I mean, here's another little backstory. When we first proposed the book, our vision, our proposal was we were going to have a chapter on different traditions. So we were going to have a chapter that took up critical theory, and we were going to have an interpretivist chapter, and we were going to have I don't remember what like maybe psychoanalysis, whatever it was. Well, part of when we started to look at the data and started working it, we said, well, wait a minute, this isn't anything different. We're working against interpretive ways of presenting data or thinking about inquiry. And so we scratched that. And that's when we came to say, no, for us, in terms of this work, it has to be these post-foundational theories, because they share different assumptions about what constitutes the subject. They share different assumptions about the way that language is active in the world. They share different assumptions about thinking about agency, and also, I love this, I don't remember now, I think this comes from Whitehead, but this idea of extension, that entities are always influencing and being prehended, he uses that language, by other entities. And so there's this stream, and I've written about that a little bit. And so from our perspective, as we've talked about it, no. And I think going back to something else that Alecia said is trying to look at the work that we're doing together as making an intervention. We talk about that. We use that language with one another. Okay, what is this intervention that we're making? What is the interruption? And that was really what started us on this Thinking with Theory project was, and I think we say this in the book, being at a conference and wanting something different to talk about analysis with our students, and not finding it, only finding things under the heading of analysis that really had to do with organizing and coding. Not that there's not value in that, but that is where it stops. And we were saying that for us was not robust analysis. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think Lisa addressed the theory part, and I agree. Just we wrote that part in the handbook chapter so that we could, just lay out how we were approaching our version of thinking with theory. And what I'll say about the thinking part is, just extending what Lisa was saying, what we noticed about coding and analysis as being synonymous, and saying, in a lot of texts and a lot of teaching, and in a lot of the research that we're reading. And so the people who I think have most influenced the way that we are writing about thinking right now is, our Deleuze and Foucault. And I talked a little bit about how Spivak is writing about thinking, but you know, the Thinking Without Method paper, I spent some time with difference and repetition, and really began to see how Deleuze is working against this dogmatic image of thought, and how in conventional interpretive qual that, you know, relies on coding as analysis, relies on recognition and resemblance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if this looks like that, it's resembling it. Okay, so that must be important. Or if I recognize it because it's in the quote literature, then it must be important. But Deleuze is saying that that's not thinking. It's just remembering, and it's just recognition. And that thought occurs when something gets opened up to the outside. Thought is actually the unthought. And so I think that's what, you know, to just repeat what Lisa was saying about how we were really frustrated with, you know, research that just reproduces the same, and that in this interpretive analysis, reliance more on what you can recognize, or what resembles what, this is like that, or even reflection, you know, holding the mirror up and reflecting back on what is the same. You know, none of that is what thinking is in the way that we are you know, putting forth in our book. So I think that thinking is something very different from, you know, what a lot of conventional interpretive research purports. And that's why I think the claims that we're making about which theories will help to do that are also really important. You know, it's all in this same ontological plane and epistemological paradigm, where, you know, the way that thinking works and the way that theories open up and engender that thought are they go together. That's something that goes together. So yeah.
So our last question, we'll spend just a few minutes on it. And as I ask it and as you share, if people want to also go ahead and start putting some questions in the Q&A icon or button, Erin and Viv can begin to read through those so that we can jump into those in just a couple of minutes. So our last question is really around, and I know that you've touched on this with your other answers, but help us think a little bit about, you know, we have a lot of students that are joining the webinar series, and they might be in spaces that don't have an Alecia or Lisa to help them navigate the academy. And as we've heard other panelists say, it's really context specific and kind of what are the norms or practices in a particular institution. So help us understand a little bit about the ways that you supervise students or mentor students, serve on committees. And you might talk specifically just about the navigating of committees and expectations within a university, but also maybe more broadly around publishing or, you know, efforts to get funding to support the work that you're doing. What are some tips or suggestions you might have? So we'll spend a few minutes on that, and then we'll open up our Q&A time.
I don't have I think Alecia has more flexibility than I do in terms of proposals and so forth. I have, even among my colleagues who support the work that I do, there's still an expectation of a proposal looking a particular way. One of the things I do tell my students is, well, I kind of laughed when I was making a joke when I was reading these questions, and I put train the IRB committees, because of all of the expectations that IRB puts on in terms of this rigidity that we're working against. But what I do say to students is, you know, less is more as far as, you know, do that, you have to do that, but that's not what is driving your research. And so, I don't know, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I think immersion in whatever the concept is something, and so that if a student wants to do something different and it's educate your committee members. Say to your committee, this is what I'm doing and this is why it's important and this is how it's going to forward my project. And I think if it comes from the student, it's a lot different than me saying to the other committee members, well, this is what, you know, this is what the student's trying to do, or this is what the student needs to do. So I think that's one thing. And I think in terms of mentoring, this goes back to what Alecia and I talked about from our experiences. It was these immersive experiences in a theory. I don't have as much opportunity to do that as I would like. I had an experience a few years ago where we needed an extra doc course. I was getting ready. I was writing a paper for a conference. What do you want to teach? Oh, I'm going to teach a 10-week seminar on Deleuze. And so we did. It was a very little amount of reading, but it was very focused. It was a small seminar. And then out of that, there were a group of 3 students who I happened to be supervising that really wanted to take off with this. And so they wanted to do directed reading for a year. And I said, fine, you direct it. You tell me what we're going to read. They created a Google Doc. And so we shared text, we shared writings. It was out of that my minor inquiry paper really began. And then it was also from that, Laura Smithers and I co-authored an article in the special issue on what do pedagogies produce. And so a lot of it is, I think, as faculty, getting out of the way of students, but also just saying, you know, do this and let me know how I can support you in it. And I'm working with a student now. I'm not his chair, but he's in, I don't know if it's intervention specialist or communication disorder. Anyway, or no, he's counseling and psychology. Okay, way out of my, but he's interested in really trying to bring some different theoretical ways of thinking to that field, maybe not as far out as what Alecia and I are talking about, but I said to him, give me a couple texts, couple key texts that you think will help you think, and I'll look at those, and then that way I can have conversations with you and your committee that will help push thinking in a different way. So those are just a couple of examples.
Yeah, yes to all of that. Get out of the way and let the students do the, you know, be the teachers of the committee. I think everything that Lisa said, I would echo all of that. I don't have a whole lot to add to that, except to just, I think that context is very, very important. I'm at a smaller university. We're a master's comprehensive. We have 1 doctoral program, and it is a small program. And in terms of the number of faculty who teach in it and who are invested in it. So it's really a very small core group, and we're all like-minded. There is a lot of openness to different formats for dissertations and proposals and all of that. And thus, you know, if since that is open, then also, you know, philosophical approaches. And it really is just, you know, I tell students the same thing that Lisa says, just educate your committee. The other thing that has emerged in the last few years is, and what I tell students is, you've got citational authority in post-qual. I mean, there's so much out there to cite to teach your committees that this is a way of doing things. So it's not like it's something that's, you know, so far out there and nobody knows anything about it. So I tell them just to heavily cite all these different ways of doing it. And that's their, you know, their part of their, you know, whatever lit review it is. And so that's been really important, I think, in the last, so that's what I would say to everyone listening. You have the citational authority to go and find people who have done, you know, really similar things or create rationales and justifications. And so, you know, write your rationale, you know, argue for why that this is important. And there's a lot out there. And, you know, I think that when, you know, Betty was talking about the shift in the field and what they all faced in the, you know, in the 90s about, and how they had to resist. I mean, now we have a whole set of literatures to cite to say that we are now on a different plane. And so that's there for you. So do that work. Just read and, you know, find what it is that you want to do and get really smart about it, and then teach your committee about it. I also think that, yeah, I'll just stop there. That's what I'll say. I've already said what I said about proposals, and that we, you know, I'm just really fortunate that we have a smaller program, and students are, and our students really are, they are doing their degrees for a lot of different reasons. You know, not a lot of them want to go into academia. A lot of them are, you know, community college. They're already teaching community colleges. So they, you know, they want a doctorate. So they're really kind of freed up to really be creative and do different things. just because they are using the experience of getting a doctorate as really an intellectual exercise. That's why they want to be there. And so that's, I'll just say that our context is really unique here. And, there's just a lot of space. We have I think one of two in the entire country expressive arts therapy certification programs. And so a lot of the students who do a doctorate with us are also doing that expressive arts therapy. And so we get some wild dissertations where, things are really, 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 even outside of my, outside of what I would ever even conceive of, what I'm capable of conceiving as inquiry. So we've got, we just have a different sort of energy at our institution. And I'm really fortunate to be where I am.
I want to add something about the publishing.
Sure, go ahead.
So one of the things I teach we call it thesis writing. It's a class that students take often when they're working on their proposals. But one of the things that I do in that class is I ask the students to find a mentor text. And so they have to find a text that they share with the other students. And it's a text that it could be in their area, it doesn't have to be, but what is it about this article that speaks to you in terms of the structure, in terms of the style of writing, and so forth? And so they use that, they talk about the text, and then I often say, well, if you find a text like that you like, maybe use that when you're beginning, use that template. And so try to write an article following that template as a way of sort of entering into that way of writing. And then we talk a lot about, this is sort of obvious, but if you're going to try to submit to a journal, read articles from that journal so that when you're presenting your article, you're in conversation with other articles in that journal and you're citing and referencing those, not just submitting something thinking, well, this sounds like an interesting title. But we really work on that in terms of how they position their work as in conversation with other scholars in a particular discipline or journal and so forth.
So I know we have some questions populating, so we'll go ahead and let Viv and Erin start on that. And then all those who are listening in, feel free to put questions in the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and Erin and Viv will try to get to as many as possible.
Yeah. Thanks very much for sharing your experiences. A lot of it resonated with me. And I'm sure a lot of the PhD students who are here also learned a lot from listening to you. So thanks for being so open and sharing the wide range of experiences you've both had and also augmenting your papers. We've got 4 questions thus far in the Q&A. So I thought I would just kick off with the last one, which is, could you discuss more about how these philosophies understand agency? So if you'd like to start with that, and then we can move on to others.
Okay. So the philosophies that Alecia and I are using, I think one way to talk about it is agency as distributed. They are not, all of the post-foundational theories that we talk about look at a decentering of the subject. Alecia and I have written about a decentering of the I, and how do we, without just anthropomorphizing, how do we shift the attention away from the individual subject, the individual researcher, and look at the way in which the world, Karen Broad talks about the world kicks back or the world pushes back. And so that is something that at least when we're talking about Deleuze, we mentioned Barad, Whitehead, who I've resisted for a long time, but as you start reading, you can't read Aaron Manning, for instance, you can't read affect theory without going back to Whitehead, because a lot of these folks draw on Whitehead. And so to talk about agency in even entity, it's, you know, Whitehead talks about entities. So he's not even talking about human, non-human. It's everything is an entity. Everything thinks. And so then we're having to rethink what thought is, and not just consciousness. So that has tremendous implications for the way in which we think about how we are in the world and how we think with things in the world. So that I'll start with that.
Yeah, that was a great summation. I don't have a whole lot to add, except, you know, Barad also, I would say, extends what Judith Butler's theory of performativity, and really works that through in her book, and extends it. And I think that that is a really helpful and provocative theory of agency. So I would encourage you to even look at that as well, and see, you know, how performativity gets us away from thinking about agency as free will or intentionality, and that agency actually emerges in the act. And so it is always shifting around, and it can't be predetermined. And so it's all of that decentering activity that Lisa has already shared. But I do think that theories of performativity are a really good way to enter into this grammar of agency as an enactment or as a performative, rather than free will or, you know, intentionality in terms of like the subject. So that's all I would add to that. But that's a great question, because it's something I think that a lot of students who are new to this theory, that's one of the things that they really have a hard time, you know, letting go of in terms of humanism, and because it's so ingrained in us, and making that ontological turn into the post-human and the new materialism and even post-structuralism, that concept of agency, I think is all over all of those theories, and it's very, very different. So you're right to be able to to ask that question and wonder about it, but it is something that you just have to keep studying and stay with, because it requires that conceptual and grammatical shift that Spivak tells us that we need to make.
So in light of that idea of distributed possible implications, and if you could elaborate on possible implications of thinking with theory in participatory research designs, if participants are from non-academic communities, was the way that it was phrased, and the analytical work is not going to be shared among all. So tagging on to that question, have you mentored or worked in context when the questions regarding that place of community have occurred or emerged?
That's a really interesting question. I know that my perspective is that you don't have to share a theoretical perspective with people that you're, doing work with. I mean, you're the inquirer, you're the researcher, you're the one who is, accountable to and responsible for the ways in which that you, represent those communities and talk and write about those communities. So I don't necessarily think that you need to share a philosophical assumption or worldview at all. I think that you are bringing to that community a way of doing and noticing that might be different, and that's what you pay attention to. That's your analysis, or part of your analysis. That's the way in which you conceptualize the work. So I've thought I have students at our institution who do community research and things like that, and they just bring they're part of that community, so they bring with them their perspectives and their approaches that are grounded in these in particular epistemologies and ontologies. So I think it's more of a matter of being really accountable to those, and understanding your ethical obligations to be transparent about those when you're writing it up or analyzing or whatever you want to, call that in that stage of the research. And also, being answerable. That's kind of Lee Patel has a really nice book on decolonizing educational research. And she was out at the University of Oregon for our ontology conference a few years ago. And I remember having conversations with her about this idea of answerability. And it really does, help you to think about ethics in that regard of being accountable and answerable, not only to people, but also the theories and the concepts that you're bringing to bear on, how you're thinking about everything.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps following on that one, there are a few questions about research and theory, and the intersection between theory and practice, which I think you have also spoken about in your chapter. But the question is asking, do you make a distinction between research and practice and doing research with theory? So, and then there's a follow-on question. I worry about this thinking being caught up inside an academic vortex. These philosophies are naturally part of the world, but do you see your work penetrating public spaces and public discourse? Is this important to you? So maybe just to think about those together, if you have any response to them.
Well, I think when Alecia talked about accountability, that's, who are we accountable to, and what is our ethical approach? And, I'm not engaged in community work or in any current research projects per se, if we're talking about doing field work, but I see that extending through the work that students and colleagues are doing in the conversations that we have. I think back to this question, we may use particular language to talk about, I'm thinking about the octopus teacher example. I may use particular language to talk about things, but that doesn't mean that I can't have conversations with other folks in the community or in other contexts that we can't talk about these things, but using different language. Maybe it's part of, where I'm from and how I was raised, but this idea of, there's an expression about, not getting above yourself. It's not being in a setting where you feel like you have to prove how smart you are or how much you know. It's it goes back to this idea of relationality, I think. I don't know that I'm answering this question very well, but I think because we deal in these philosophical worlds, it doesn't mean that we aren't in the world and of the world and making decisions and having hopefully impacts in our own communities. And so that is also, I think, comparable to this idea of this theory practice binary that Alecia and I are really working hard to continue to refute. Who says it can't all be part of the same conversation? I mean, it's a difficult question, but I think again, when Alecia was talking, I kept thinking about this idea of accountability. So who are we accountable?
Yeah, and I'll just agree with all of that and just reinforce the idea that I just don't see theory and practice as being separate. I don't, when you think about going out into the community, for one thing, I think that teaching is community. I think I am part of a community, so I would really question, well, what do you mean by community? And is there a binary there going on between, academic life and, some other life? But our institution is in a small town, a rural part of the state, and we, you talk about distributed agency. We have a distributed community because we have people who come from 2 hours away to get their degrees because of it's such a rural place. So I think that part of what I see as this kind of distributed way of being in the world is, I teach master's and EDS students and doctoral students who are, all over the northeastern part of our state, like I said, which is very rural, and their way of thinking shifts so much that it can't not shape who they are as a school principal, for example. Once a school principal reads Foucault, I am hoping that they lead their school very differently. And I have seen instances of that. So while I may not be the one who is going into a school and saying, okay, this is how you need to, discipline, there are students who read Foucault and then they are in positions of decision-making and authority, and so to speak, in order to impact policy. Once you read a post-structural discourse analysis of policy, you will never encounter policy the same way again. So I have a lot of students who work with, in school context at the level of policy, where they are at the table writing policy. And once they've read discourse theory and they understand what is happening when a policy is enacted, then they are the ones who are, making those direct, if you want to say it that way, like a direct influence on how this theory is shaping their world. So, I think it's this idea of, really being distributed rather than centering myself and saying, well, this is how I see the world, and then trying to, get everybody on my bandwagon. It comes through relationships and teaching and building community that way. And I'll also say that, in personal, we've just been here in this country, we've just been through a very tumultuous election cycle. And I could not have really had conversations with people about how I've viewed things going on without some of the theories that, that I've read, the philosophical frameworks that inform my way of talking to other people about power and knowledge. And so I don't see that theory practice divide in that way. I think that, you just, well, that's all I'll say. I'll stop there. Yeah.
So maybe we can have one final question and then we'll need to wrap up. So I think Erin, you might be the one asking it.
Sure. So there was a question about how art can guide this way of thinking. How do you work with art and thinking?
Well, I guess we could have a long conversation about what is art. But, going back to my poetry example, I know that my students have been, Betty, if you're out there, my students have been quoting you from your earlier webinar, read, read, read. And so I want students to read, 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 but not just theoretical texts. I want them to read poetry. I want them to read fiction. I want them to be encountering different forms of expression as a way of helping them language the world, see the world, encounter the world. So, there's some lovely examples of different types of academic texts, although they're not as plentiful as we might like in the education field. And I can't think of the one, but there was a graphic novel by a fellow that was at Columbia University. But anyway, I just think it's, how do we think about expression and what counts as expression, and really encouraging students to, do you have it on your shelf, Erin?
I think it's Nick Susanis.
Yes, it is. Thank you. And so anyway, that's the brief, unflattening. That's the brief response is, I want students to just be exposed to difference through art, through literature.
So maybe we should end there. And I know that there's questions we did not get to, but I perhaps if Lisa and Alecia nod a yes, invite people if they have a specific question that they could email them or send them your way through email, and that you too might be willing to respond in that way. Would that be all right? So if you have a question that you typed in, you might want to copy it, paste it somewhere else and send it their way later. I'm sure they'd be happy to respond to that as well. Just want to say thanks to you both for making time, for being honest and thinking about your context and how this work manifests for you with your students and in your communities and abroad. So thank you so much. It was so lovely. Viv, do you want to wrap us up for today?
Yeah. I also wanted to thank everyone for attending. I think we had about 110 people at one particular point. Sorry about the dogs barking. So as we said before, this has been recorded, and we'll post the information on the webinar series page, and you can then access it on YouTube and also subscribe to our channel. So we try and end absolutely promptly so that people aren't inconvenienced. Thanks so much to everyone. I think it was very generative.
Yeah, and thanks again, Candace, Erin, Viv, for all of your work in putting this together and for inviting us.
Absolutely.
Yes,
thanks.
It's been a real pleasure.
So just a reminder, our next one is December 17th. Check out our website for the details about that. We'll be speaking with Dr. Kakali Bhattacharya, and she's at the University of Florida. And so join us on December 17th. And as Viv said, check out our recorded ones on the website. So thanks to you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there'll be suggested readings as usual too. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.